On June 4th, 2025, the Trump administration asked the U.S. Congress to claw back $9.4 billion in spending that lawmakers had previously approved in the federal budget. Trump said that was the amount of waste, fraud, and abuse uncovered by his biggest campaign donor, Elon Musk, through the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. It's a far cry from the $2 trillion of wasteful spending Musk had promised to find. To keep the president happy, Musk has taken aim at some of Trump's favorite targets: PBS, NPR, and almost every dollar of foreign aid. I'm David Hunt. The government's efforts to dismantle USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, have been extensively documented in the media. The administration's termination of 5,341 foreign aid projects has disrupted global health programs and reduced access to education and health care for millions. Thousands have likely died as a direct result of the sudden cutoff of funding, according to Boston University. Less well documented has been the impact of the funding cuts on programs advancing the health, safety, and empowerment of LGBTQ people around the world. To explore that part of the story, I sat down with Ari Shaw, Senior Fellow and Director of International Programs at the Williams Institute.
The Williams Institute is a think tank based at UCLA School of Law focused on LGBTQ law and policy. And our goal is to really ensure that evidence and data are brought to bear on policymaking and judicial decision-making that impacts LGBTQ people. For so long, myths and stereotypes have been relied on and unfortunately to this day still in many cases to generate bad policy and bad laws that impact LGBTQ people.
In a brief published in January, shortly after Trump signed an executive order pausing all foreign aid, Shaw suggested the order was just the first step toward the Trump administration's broader goal of eliminating LGBTQ issues from U.S. foreign policy and development assistance. He was right. A 90-day pause in aid led to the cancellation of thousands of programs, including more than 100 serving LGBTQ people around the world. Among the cuts, $5 million to combat gender-based violence and anti-LGBTQ violence in Honduras, $1.3 million to promote social, economic, and political inclusion for LGBTQ people in North Macedonia, $4 million for a gay men's health initiative in South Africa, $10.5 million for international disaster assistance for organizations led by women, disabled, and LGBTQ people in 24 countries. Those cuts pale compared to the amount of funding pulled from HIV/AIDS programs. The Trump administration canceled $262 million for the Joint United Nations Program on HIV/AIDS and $238 million for the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. And it effectively ended President George W. Bush's signature foreign aid initiative, PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, first signed into law in 2003. The countries impacted include some of the poorest in the world, 18 African nations, including Uganda, Burundi, and South Sudan, India, Indonesia, and Nepal in Asia, Guatemala and Nicaragua in Central America, and the Caribbean nations of Jamaica and the Dominican Republic. The impact is, in the words of the New York Times, heartbreaking. Reporting from Kampala, Uganda in March, New York Times reporter Abdi Latif Tahir said, "The rapid loss of aid from the United States has left many gay Ugandans terrified." He reported the conditions for LGBTQ Ugandans is so perilous that shelters often move locations frequently or relocate individuals in order to avoid personal attacks or raids from the authorities. Now, some of those shelters are beginning to close. The situation is much the same for LGBTQ people in other countries, in other parts of the world, according to Ari Shaw.
To this day, there are still more than 60 countries that criminalize consensual same-sex activity. I think something like 11 have the death penalty as one of the penalties for individuals who are convicted of under these criminal statutes. In many countries, being transgender or in some way kind of deviating from normative gender identities or gender expressions is criminalized as well.
The Williams Institute has played a key role in helping to advance human rights for LGBTQ people. Until funding was canceled by the Trump administration in January, the Institute participated in 2 USAID programs in the current fiscal year: a task force providing technical assistance to USAID programs seeking to serve marginalized populations, and the Global Human Rights Initiative, a broad-based effort to advance human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Through his contacts at those programs, Shaw has seen the devastating impact of Trump's funding cuts.
I've certainly had conversations with groups around the world who have lost their funding, that have had to either close their doors entirely or lay off substantial numbers of staff and employees. And these are organizations, again, that are providing, in many cases, life-saving, necessary care and services to the community, providing medical services or shelters for unhoused or other people in really dire circumstances whose lives are at risk now because they are not able to access these services. It's a really dire set of circumstances, and there's a lot of fear and precarity because it's not clear where additional funding would come from. In many cases, even just services that were already performed, that were contracted by the U.S. government through USAID, where organizations they've already provided the services and are just supposed to be paid or reimbursed for those expenses. They haven't been able to receive those funds. So it really is a kind of life or death scenario for a number of organizations, and as a result, for individuals and communities that are dependent on those organizations for services.
You are listening to This Way Out, the International LGBTQ Radio Magazine. I'm David Hunt, continuing my conversation with Ari Shaw, Senior Fellow and Director of International Programs at the Williams Institute at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. Foreign aid for LGBTQ programs is a relatively new endeavor. The Biden administration embraced inclusive development practices shortly after Joe Biden's inauguration in January 2021. USAID increased resources for LGBTQ programming from $6 million in 2021 to $25 million in 2024. At this level, USAID was the second largest global donor to activities supporting LGBTQ people in developing countries, Shaw says.
The Biden administration, I think, in many respects, continued what was started under the Obama administration in terms of really acknowledging the importance of advancing LGBT rights through U.S. foreign policy, and the importance of kind of strong U.S. leadership on these issues at the global stage. But under President Biden, LGBTI rights were really sort of elevated and centered as a priority within U.S. foreign policy and development assistance. In his first days in office, he issued a presidential memorandum that specifically centered advancing the human rights of LGBTQI+ people in U.S. foreign policy and development assistance, and called on federal agencies to ensure that they were taking steps to advance these rights, and kind of specifically called out issues around ending so-called conversion therapy practices, efforts to debunked efforts to change sexual orientation or gender identity, as well as protecting the rights of LGBTQI+ migrants and refugees, and sort of broadly decriminalizing consensual same-sex activity around the world. So it was a really, I think, important sort of milestone in terms of establishing a clear priority for U.S. foreign policy and kind of guiding how the US would engage with other countries and in multilateral spaces like the United Nations and the World Bank in terms of, working to advance these human rights.
What Trump and opponents of foreign aid don't appreciate is the importance of soft power to America's standing in the world and to the promotion of its interests.
When you think about foreign aid, it's often held up as, an example of waste and abuse, but really it is, less than 1% of the entire US government and reaps, tremendous benefit in terms of the value that the US government and the American people receive in return by taking actions that, support humanitarian assistance or global health or protecting the basic human rights of individuals around the world. The U.S. is able to be seen by local communities as a partner who supports fundamental freedoms, who supports sort of basic needs and services that comes to support local communities after a humanitarian disaster or other complex emergencies that require assistance. And at a very basic level, that helps people around the world see us as in a benevolent light, in a good light, right? As a strong, supportive partner and not as an adversary. And, it's precisely this type of foreign assistance that, serves a kind of larger goal of ensuring the US has kind of moral leadership and, the ability to cultivate and support strong allies around the world.
It's not just the cancellation of foreign aid that's created a crisis for aid recipients around the world. The sudden and chaotic nature of the funding cuts and the unsupported claims of waste, fraud, and abuse took many programs by surprise and left them and their clients struggling to survive.
When the U.S. government deploys that sort of rhetoric and policymaking, it reinforces the stigma and gives permission to leaders and groups that oppose LGBTQI+ rights to further drive that message and attacks on the community. It's fair to look at federal agencies and programs and examine where there are opportunities to make things more efficient, more streamlined, and ensure that services and programs are being delivered in the most cost-effective way possible. But in the case of the foreign aid pause and review, I think a cudgel was used when a scalpel was really needed. And so, as you note, life-saving critical programs were cut in one fell swoop when a more systematic, thoughtful review of individual programs and investments could have made more sense. We definitely have seen research and reporting that shows the impact that these cuts have had already, whether it's eliminating life-saving HIV treatment and prevention medications through PEPFAR, whether it's international disaster assistance and humanitarian responses. We've also seen this through the State Department's Migration and Refugee Assistance Fund that's been cut. The door to refugee resettlement essentially shut for nearly all people that are fleeing violence and persecution and trying to seek refuge in the United States. So it's already had tremendous consequences for individuals and in countries around the world.
Is the damage to America's reputation and moral leadership permanent? It's too soon to tell, but reputations take far longer to build or rebuild than they do to dismantle.
I think it's clear that under the Trump administration, the U.S. is fully abdicating its global leadership on LGBTQI+ rights, not only in terms of the pause or the elimination of foreign aid funding, but also, we see it in the proposed reorganization of the State Department that has been coming out in recent weeks, where programming pertaining to human rights and the rule of law is either being eliminated or drastically reduced. The Trump administration, I think unsurprisingly, has not appointed a special envoy for LGBTQI+ rights of their own. They've withdrawn from the UN Human Rights Council, which is an important body for assessing the human rights situation of various countries, including how they're treating LGBTQI plus people and communities, and the sort of general turn or affinity that the Trump administration seems to have for authoritarian leaders and systems is really kind of anathema to the kind of support for liberal democratic values, including minority protections and support for LGBTQI plus rights that we saw under the previous administration. So I think across the board, we're seeing the Trump administration make an about face in terms of how it's acting on the global stage and with regard to LGBTQI plus rights.
But the United States is not alone on the world stage. Other nations, perhaps allies, perhaps adversaries, may take America's place, exercising the soft power that once enabled the U.S. to lead with its heart, not just its muscle. I'd like to thank Ari Shaw for sharing his insights for this program. Shaw is a senior fellow and director of international programs at the Williams Institute at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. For This Way Out, I'm David Hunt.
Sometimes I